All right, we don't want to keep everyone waiting for too long, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining us today. Our webinar today is on the eligible project types and the eligible expenses in the HUD Continuum of Care program, and I'm Lauren Peretti, and my co-trainer today will be Howard Birchman, and we're also joined today by Sarah Zeiderveen, and we are all part of Housing Innovations training and consulting firm. And we work with COCs all around the country. Our team has been providing support to COCs like yours for several decades. I think Howard's actually been working at the CoC program since the inception of the program, and he is the person on our team who works most closely with your CoC. And Howard, how long have you been working with the Rhode Island CoC? I'm not even sure. Long time.
Oh, the Rhode Island CoC.
Yeah.
Since we did their work with them on their opening doors plan, which is over a decade ago.
Yeah. Okay. So we are super happy to be here with you all today. And before we get started, here is next slide, Sarah. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. So if you are able, please turn your camera on. We love to be able to see who's in the room, and I think it's nice for you all to be able to see each other. We certainly understand if you are not camera ready this morning. Sarah will put the slides, I think, into the chat box in a moment. If they're not there already, they will also be posted onto the Rhode Island Continuum of Care website. And we want to say that please don't hesitate to ask questions today. These sessions, I think, are always more interesting if there's some conversation rather than just Howard and I talking for the 2 hours. So we are absolutely want to hear all of your questions and answer all of your questions. So at any time, please raise your hand and you can unmute and ask your question. Also, feel free to use the Q&A feature and put your questions in there. That is located, you should see that at the top of your screen, right to the right of the chat button. So please use the Q&A and not the chat if you can, although we'll try to also take a look at the chat and make sure we're answering all the questions that come in, no matter which way they come in. So Rosa is recording the session for us this morning, and that will also be posted to the Rhode Island Continuum of Care's website. And finally, we are scheduled to be together for 2 hours. We will promise you, we will get you out on time. So we'll finish at 3. I think depending upon how many questions there are, we may even finish earlier than that. There are some slides that we included in the deck today that are really for reference. There's some topics that are relevant to what we're going to be talking about today that TAC is going to be covering in a future webinar. So we're not going to cover those slides today, but we wanted you to have those as a reference for later in case they're helpful to you. So the other thing is that Howard and I will try very hard not to lapse into HUD speak and use a whole bunch of acronyms, because we recognize that a lot of you have probably been around for a long time and will know what all those acronyms are, but some of you may be new. If at any time we say something that you don't understand, please stop us, because if you didn't understand it, colleagues of yours probably didn't also, and we should stop and explain. So please don't hesitate. Next slide. So this is our agenda for today. We'll in a minute ask you guys to introduce yourselves in the chat, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time today talking about what are the types of projects or component types, as HUD says, that are eligible under the CoC program, and what are the costs that are eligible under each of those component types. And then we'll dive more into detail on the Supportive Services budget line item and what's eligible on that, the Violence Against Women Act or VAWA budget line item, and the Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS, budget line items. Then the things that are listed as additional resources here, rental assistance, leasing, operating, and project administration, those are the things that TAC is going to be covering in a future webinar. So we've got some slides on that, but we're not going to go through those slides today, but they're there for your reference. And then we'll hopefully have some time at the end to take any additional questions. But as I said, please don't wait until the end. We'll take questions as they arise throughout the presentation today. Next slide. So Howard and I will also be back on April 9th to talk about some special rules for youth homelessness demonstration program or YHDP grants. So if you are a YHDP grantee, please join us again on April 9th. We are not going to be covering those topics today. They will be covered in a separate session just for YHDP grants on April 9th. And in that session, we will talk about certain kinds of project types that are sort of unique to the YHDP program. We'll talk about the special rules that HUD has for the YHDP program. So for example, HUD enables these things they call special activities, which allows you to do things that are not normally allowable in the CoC program if you are a YHDP grant and have requested to do those things, and in some cases been approved by HUD to do those things. So please, we look forward to seeing you if you are a YHDP grantee again on April 9th. Next slide. So we would love to be able to go around and have a chance to get to know you all a little bit individually, but we've got 28 people in the room today, so that's probably not going to be possible. So what we would like is to ask you guys to please take a moment to put into the chat what your agency you work for, what your role is at that agency, where you're located, and the content today can be pretty dry, talking about HUD rules. So we'd like to start off with some smiles. So share with your colleagues. Some things that make you smile. I wonder, Rosa, can we get the folks muted that are unmuted? Yeah. Okay, thanks. So for me, I'll start. So it's springtime, and I know for me, looking outside and seeing my flowers starting to sprout and things starting to grow, that makes me smile. So let's look in the chat here to see if we've got some people. Oh, so okay. So is there somebody ate a Zeppeli today for St. Joe? Zeppelis also make me smile. So thanks, Nicole, for sharing that. So keep going. People are putting that information in the chat room. So we've got somebody that likes music and food. Also, those things also make me smile. Leaving work while the sun is still shining. Oh, thank you for mentioning that. That's a huge one. I know I'm going to be going for a hike today after work, and I'm super excited that I'll still have some sunshine for that. So, all right, keep sharing all those smiles in the chat with your colleagues, and I'm going to move us on to the next slide. So each of your agencies is funded to provide a particular kind of assistance through your CoC grants. So HUD calls these project types components, and it's important for you to know what HUD component your project is funded to do, right? So it might be permanent supportive housing, it might be rapid rehousing, it might be joint transitional rapid rehousing, or it might be supportive services only. And it's important to understand not just which of those component types you're funded for, but also what costs are eligible under that component type and can be billed to HUD, right? And of course, what costs are ineligible. So you can only bill HUD for costs that are specifically defined by HUD as eligible in the CoC program rule. And if you expend HUD's money on things that are not eligible, right, HUD can do what they call recapture, which basically means they ask your agency to repay that money to the federal government. So we, of course, never want to see that happen. We want all of the money that comes into Rhode Island to help folks experiencing homelessness stay in Rhode Island and be used for that purpose. So one of our big goals today in this training session is to help you make sure that you understand what costs are eligible so that you're not billing ineligible things to your HUD grants and having to give any money back to the federal government. So this slide is showing us what costs are eligible if you have a permanent supportive housing grant or if you have a rapid rehousing grant. And if you're not sure, don't worry, we're going to talk about in a minute how to make sure you know what component type and what costs are eligible on your grant. So in permanent supportive housing, you are able to use an operating budget line item, a leasing budget line item, a rental assistance budget line item. And if you're using rental assistance, your grant will specify whether it's tenant-based rental assistance, project-based rental assistance, or sponsor-based rental assistance, right? So tenant-based rental assistance is generally scattered site, right, where people are able to use that rental assistance to rent any unit, that they choose in the community, as long as that unit meets HUD standards like housing quality standards and rent reasonableness, as opposed to project-based or sponsor-based rental assistance, right, which are typically, in particular, project-based congregate, right? So the assistance is tied to a particular building. And then in sponsor-based rental assistance, often that's congregate, but there's some flexibility there for the sponsor also to be able to master lease scattered site units in the community, right? So operations, leasing, rental assistance, supportive services, HMIS, and admin are the eligible budget line items in PSH. And we're going to go through more details about many of these things and what specifically is eligible under each today, and then the things that we don't cover today, TAC is going to cover in a future webinar. And then for rapid rehousing, you can see that there's a much more limited set of eligible activities, right? So in rapid rehousing, it's going to be tenant-based rental assistance, supportive services, HMIS, and administration, right? Now, there's some special rules, as I said earlier, for YHDP. We're not going to cover those today, but we will be covering those on April 9th. So again, it's critical for you to know which of these costs are actually in your project's budget that has been approved by HUD, and we'll talk in a minute about how you can do that. So next slide. It gets a little bit more complicated if you've got, I think there are a few joint TH rapid rehousing programs in your continuum of care, and it's a little bit more complicated if you are a joint TH rapid rehousing program. So you can see on this slide, right, there are certain expenses that are only eligible in the TH component. There's certain expenses that are only eligible in the rapid rehousing component, and then there's some expenses that are eligible across the entire project, right? So in the transitional component, you can use leasing, operating, and supportive services. And in the rapid rehousing component, you can use tenant-based rental assistance and supportive services. And then for the entire project, you can use HMIS and admin, right? So it gets a little tricky here because you may see in your grant agreement, right, that you've got an operating budget line item, but you can't use that operating budget line item on units in the rapid rehousing component, right? You can only use that operating budget line item on units in the transitional component. So for example, if you've got a rapid rehousing unit, right, you can't use that operating budget line item to pay for maintenance or repairs in that rapid rehousing unit because HUD considers maintenance and repairs to be an operating budget line item, right, not an eligible operating expense. And HUD considers those to be the landlord's responsibility in a tenant-based rental assistance program. So, you know, the amount of money that you're paying based upon the rent reasonableness standard, right, is supposed to be sufficient to cover those maintenance and repair costs. So, so again, certain expenses eligible under the transitional component, certain expenses eligible under the rapid housing component, and then HMIS and admin is kind of overarching, and you can use that for the project as a whole. Next slide. So you've also got in your continuum of care projects that don't have any housing units in the project, right? So those projects are providing services to people, but are not actually providing a housing unit for people. So I think those include coordinated entry. I think you've got some YHDP, like a drop-in center, a navigator program, a YHDP outreach program. I think there's a YHDP SOAR program in your CoC. Those HUD calls supportive services only, and the only eligible budget line items in those projects are the supportive services budget line item, and again, the HMIS and the admin budget line items. So, all right, next slide. So if you're listening to me and going, oh no, I don't know what component type I have, or I don't know what budget line items are in my, you know, are part of my grant, no worries, right? There's an easy way to find that out. That information is going to be in your HUD grant agreement. So your HUD grant agreement is going to tell you you're a PSH program or you're a rapid rehousing program. And it's also going to say which budget line items of the ones that we just went through are authorized for you in your particular program to spend your CoC funds on, right? So if you don't know that information already, please be sure that you check your grant agreement so you can be sure that you don't expend CoC or matching funds on any ineligible costs, because again, we don't ever want to see you have to send money back to the federal government. Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how the federal government determines whether or not a cost is eligible. So only costs that meet all 4 of the criteria on this slide are eligible. And so that means that you can't expend CoC funds on any cost that doesn't meet all 4 criteria, right? So first, you have to make sure, and this is always important. It's always the #1 recapture risk we see when we go out and monitor. You have to make sure that you've got documentation in all of your client files that that person was eligible for your project at the time they entered the project. So I think particularly in this difficult fiscal environment that we find ourselves in, right, you want to be extra sure that for every client that you're serving, you've got eligibility you've got documentation showing that they were homeless when they entered your project. And then if you're a PSH project, you also want to make sure that you've got documentation that they met the HUD definition of disability, and that they were either dedicated plus, they met the dedicated plus homelessness definition, or in some cases the chronic homelessness definition. And we're not going to go through today what the eligibility documentation criteria are. TAC is going to be reviewing those details in an upcoming webinar. So for today, just the thing that you need to know is just that you can only expend CoC funds on eligible participants, right? So make sure you've got that eligibility documentation, and don't use CoC funds to pay for things for someone that's not enrolled in your project, right? So for example, don't use your CoC funds to pay for a security deposit for someone that you never entered into HMIS into your program, right? You only can expend CoC funds on eligible CoC enrolled clients. So, the next thing on here, and you'll see throughout our slides today, there's some things that are green and underlined. Those are live hyperlinks. So when you go into the actual slides, you'll be able to click on that and it will take you, in this case, to the CoC program interim rule. And the CoC program interim rule is the source document, right, that you can always refer to know whether or not a cost is eligible, right? So the CoC program interim rule specifies all the costs that are eligible for each component type. And only things specified in the rule as eligible are eligible. The rule also specifies some things that are not eligible, right? So, but the important thing to keep in mind is that just because the rule doesn't say something isn't eligible doesn't mean that it's eligible, right? So you can only spend the money on things that the rule specifically says are eligible. And then the third item here, when you submit a project application in eSNAPS to HUD, it includes a budget, right? And once HUD announces the awards after each competition, you know, they may have questions or concerns that they raised about things that are in your budget. They may ask you through what's known as the technical submission process to go into eSNAPS. You guys might be familiar with it. It's the C1.9A module in eSNAPS. They may ask you to change some things in your budget. Ultimately, they will approve your budget. And then once they have approved your budget, that budget becomes part of your grant agreement, right? And you can only expend CoC funds on things that are in your approved budget, right? So for matching funds, you can expend them on any eligible CoC expense. But for CoC funds, you can only expend them on things that are in your approved budget. So for example, if you have a PSH project and you did not ask for any HMIS money in your budget, right? That's not going to be in your grant agreement. And then you can't expend your CoC funds on HMIS expenses. But you could expend your matching funds on HMIS expenses because that's an eligible cost for your project, right? So, so the other thing to keep in mind here that I think gets a little confusing for people is that when you do like a new project application in particular in eSNAPS, right, you have to do a detailed supportive services budget. And that budget is broken down into different categories, right? It has a case management category, it has a needs assessment category, it has a transportation category, right? There may be a dozen or so categories within that supportive services budget. When you get your grant agreement, there's just one supportive services budget line item, right? So you don't have to worry about if in your project application, let's say you put all of your money in case management. You said $100,000 for case management. You didn't put any money on the needs assessment line. You didn't put any money on the transportation line, whatever. You can still expend money on those lines, right? Because HUD considers that supportive services budget line item to be one budget line item. So you don't need a grant agreement amendment in order to expend money on those other categories, as long as you have a supportive services budget line item in your budget. So, and then the last thing here, you want to make sure that your expenses are documented, right? Expenses that are not documented are not eligible. And we'll talk more in a minute about what you need to do to document expenses. Next slide. So we are going to try a new trick here. So bear with us. I think Sarah is going to try to launch a poll in a application that we have not previously used, full transparency. So if we've got, okay, here we go. So Sarah just put into the meeting chat a link. If you click on that link, that should open a poll. And I think Sarah is going to share with us if we can. If not, we'll talk about it as a group.
Yeah, it won't let me, Rosa,
It's
won't
okay.
let me project into your Teams.
Rosa, are you able to click on the link and project into Teams? If not, we'll just talk about it. as a group? Apologies, guys. We're building this airplane as we fly it, so to speak. The tech gods are not smiling upon us.
Okay, people are voting though.
People are voting, so that's good. So maybe you could just share, if Rose is not able to like actually share the results, maybe you could just tell us, Sarah, what the results are in a minute or two. We'll give people a couple minutes. And then.
Oh shoot, they're not voting on the.
Yeah, I see them voting.
Okay, but are they voting on the right question?
It's not the right question.
Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Let's just do it all together out loud as a group. So the question is, how do I know what costs are eligible on my CoC grant? And there are 3 options, right? So I can look at the original project application we submitted to HUD when the grant was first funded. I can find out on Google, or I can look at my grant agreement and any amendments to the agreement. And the correct answer here is number 3. I can look at my grant agreement and any amendments to the agreement. So, you know, you can certainly look back at your original project application, right? But particularly if your project has been around a while, that is not necessarily going to tell you what your budget is. There's often a difference between what you asked for in your application and what is actually awarded. So for example, if you've got a rental assistance budget line item, you're probably going to there'll be changes in FMR. So what's in your application is not necessarily going to match what you were awarded. You cannot find out on Google this information. So the correct answer here, and again, if you don't know what your component type is, and or you don't know what your approved budget line items are, be sure you check that grant agreement and any amendments that you requested to that grant agreement in order to know what exactly your eligible expenses are. All right, next slide. So we're going to talk now about the 4 federal cost principles. So all costs that you bill to HUD have got to meet all of these 4 principles, right? So they've got to be reasonable, they've got to be allocable, they've got to be consistently treated, and they have to be allowable. So to be reasonable, right, the federal government considers a cost to be reasonable when it's consistent with what a prudent person would pay in similar circumstances, right? So for example, if you were to be offering GED classes for the folks that live at your PSH program, and you hire an instructor to provide a GED class, and HUD comes in and monitors and sees that you paid that instructor, you know, $25,000 to teach 1 GED class, right? They're probably going to say that's not reasonable. And then if it's not reasonable, they can recapture the funds. So we'll talk a little bit more about cost reasonableness also in a minute. The cost has to be allocable to your CoC grant. So we talked a little bit about this already. So if you bought computers, right? So the CoC money is meant to be spent on expenses for the CoC project, right? So if you bought computers for staff in your shelter program, let's say, using CoC funds, that's not going to be an eligible CoC expense, right? Buying computers for your staff that are working in your CoC project, that's an eligible CoC expense. In terms of consistently treated, TAC is going to cover the differences between what an indirect and a direct cost are in an upcoming webinar. For now, just know that you have to classify costs as either direct or indirect, and you can't treat the same cost as both direct and indirect. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. TAC is going to cover it in a webinar coming up. And then finally, the cost has to be allowable. So I think I said this earlier, in order to be allowable, it has to be specifically defined in the CoC program interim rule as an eligible cost. And when you are expending your CoC funds, those costs must also be on your project's HUD approved budget. Next slide. So this slide explains the difference between an eligible cost and an approved cost, right? So as I've said several times now, eligible costs are those that are included and explicitly stated in the CoC program interim rule as being eligible, right? And approved costs are costs that are in the budget that's in your grant agreement. So you can spend your matching funds on any eligible cost, but you can only expend your CoC program funds on approved costs, okay? So if it's not in your particular program CoC budget that's been approved by HUD, don't spend CoC funds on it. So, so if you have, let's say you have the example we talked about before, right? You want to expend money on HMIS, but you don't have an HMIS budget line item in your grant. So you can ask HUD for an amendment, and you can add a budget line item to your grant. Now, don't get excited, right? Adding a budget line item doesn't mean adding more money. You can basically move money out of a different budget line item. So let's say you have more money, you've got underspending in supportive services, and you want to move that money into HMIS. You can ask for an amendment to create the HMIS budget line item, and you can move money out of supportive services into HMIS. But at the end of the day, the total grant amount is still going to be the same. All right. Next slide. So this slide talks about cost allocability. We covered a lot of this already. We'll talk about more about what reasonable means on the next slide. So I think what we've not talked about yet is documenting costs. So, so you've got to make sure that your costs are documented, as I said. They're not documented, they're not eligible. So for example, most of you, probably all of you, your biggest cost on these grants is going to be for staff salaries. So if you're charging staff salaries to your HUD grant, then you need to have backup documentation for those salaries that you're charging. So if you've got someone who is working on just one project and one budget line item, right? So you have a case manager, that case manager only works on your CoC project, and that case manager only works on the supportive services budget line item, then all you're going to need is a timesheet, right? I think in many cases, it's more complicated than that, right? You've got staff that are working on multiple projects, or they're working on multiple budget line items. And in that case, you're going to need some additional backup documentation that shows HUD the hours that they worked on each project and on each budget line item. And I know that that's a pain, but unfortunately, those are the HUD rules. And TAC is going to, again, talk in more detail about that in an upcoming webinar. Another example of how commonly you guys are documenting costs in a CoC project, many of you probably have a rental assistance budget line item and you're using your funds to pay those rents. So you'll want to make sure you have a lease, right? And you'll want to make sure that you've got a rent calculation, right? That shows what the tenant's paying and what's the subsidies paying, that you've got backup documentation for that income. Again, all of this stuff will be covered in greater detail in future webinars. And you want to make sure that you've got documentation that the rent was paid to the landlord that's listed on the lease, right? So those are just a couple of examples of how you would document expenses in the CoC program. So if you don't have that documentation, again, if HUD were to come out and monitor, they could say, you don't have the documentation. Normally they're going to give you a chance to produce the documentation. If you're unable to produce the documentation, they could say that you have to pay that money back to the federal government. Next slide. So here we dig in a little bit more about what it means to be reasonable, what the federal government would consider to be a reasonable cost. And basically, all the expenses have to serve a legitimate purpose, for running your project, project, right? So, many of you may do an annual staff appreciation event. That's a wonderful thing to do. We hope you do that. You may take people to an amusement park or a botanic gardens or whatever. Those kinds of things are not costs for your CoC project, and they're not, HUD would not find those as reasonable expenses on your CoC project, right? So those are explicitly ineligible costs under the federal financial rules. So again, I said this before, the main thing to think about when you're thinking about reasonable cost is this a cost that's consistent with what a prudent person would pay in similar circumstances? So for example, again, most of your costs are probably staff salaries. So you want to make sure you pay your staff an amount that's generally aligned with the rates paid to similar staff in your area, right? You're not going to pay your case manager $300,000 a year, though that would be lovely. I think case managers all deserve to get paid $300,000 a year and probably even more. HUD would likely find that expense to be not reasonable. Similarly, if you buy computers, right? So, your staff can enter information into HMIS. You'll want to show that you followed your agency's procurement policies, which we'll discuss more in detail on the next slide. But basically, if you show that you followed your agency's procurement policies, that's, ensures that you paid a reasonable amount for anything that you're using, that you're buying, using HUD money to buy. Next slide. Procurement policies. So you want to be sure that your agency has written procurement policies and procedures. So this is normally something that's developed by your fiscal office. They'll make sure that those policies are in alignment with the federal procurement rules. If you are not familiar with your agency's procurement policies and you are responsible for buying things with CoC funds, you want to make sure you ask your fiscal department to provide you with those procurement policies. If they say to you, we don't have procurement policies, then you're going to want to make sure that those policies are developed, because having written procurement policies is a requirement if you receive federal funding. So then you just want to be sure that you follow those policies whenever you're buying something with CoC funds. So these are small grants, usually, like these are not huge amounts of money that your agencies are getting for these programs. And HUD considers any purchase that is for less than $250,000 to be what they call a small purchase. Given the size of these grants, I can't imagine a scenario where you're buying something that is more than $250,000. So pretty much everything that you do is going to be under the small purchases procurement procedures. So when you're doing small purchases, it's pretty straightforward, right? You're going to make sure you get 3 to 5 competitive quotes and that you select the most reasonable offer. So your agency may also have in your procurement policies something that allows you to do even simpler than, you don't even need to get 3 to 5 quotes. Those are usually called micro purchases. So look at your agency's policies. For very small purchases, you might not even need the quotes, but you still have to make sure that the costs are reasonable, right? So you're not going to spend $20,000 for a laptop, for example. So if you're using the small purchase method, right, let's say you're understaffed, right, and you're going to hire a staffing agency to temporarily fill a position because you're struggling to fill the position, right? You would want to get quotes from 3 to 5 qualified staffing contractors and then select the one that's most reasonable. Now, keep in mind that most reasonable does not necessarily always have to mean the lowest quote, right? So there may be circumstances where you're not going to select the lowest quote. If you're doing that, you've got to make sure that you document what factors you considered when you decided which quote provided the best overall value. Because sometimes when you get quotes, it's not apples to oranges. So the one quote is a little bit higher than another quote, they're actually providing more value to their organization, to your organization. So, and then the last thing here, when you're using the small purchase method, you're going to use generally purchase orders, right? In very rare circumstances, you might use, like for very small things, right? You might use petty cash, right? So if you're buying a bus token for a client, you might use petty cash. But generally for any significant purchase, you're going to use a purchase order. All right, next slide. So if HUD finds, we talked about some of these things already, if HUD finds that you have expended CoC funds on ineligible expenses, there are certain sanctions that they may impose on your agency. So the first one is absolutely the most common one. They come out and they monitor, they find you had an ineligible expense, and they require you to do a corrective action plan to say, you know, how you're going to avoid making that mistake again. And they're probably going to require you to pay back that money. So that's the first one. In more egregious situations, right, they may say, you know what, until we've got a corrective action plan here that makes us confident that your organization has the necessary measures in place to, you know, administer these funds, we are going to suspend your ability to be able to draw down from the lock system. That's going to be rare. In even more egregious situations, right, they may say, hey, we don't think your organization, you know, we've asked you multiple times for a corrective action plan, you've not been responsive, you know, now we're going to move to replace you as a grantee on this grant. We're going to find another organization and we are going to have them run this project moving forward. Normally when that happens in consultation with the CoC, and the CoC is involved in identifying another organization that would run the project. Again, this is going to be a rare circumstance. The next thing, reimburse or recapture, we already talked about that. And then finally, this is going to be, you know, very, very rare that they're going to come in and they're going to say, you know what, we're not going to fund this project anymore. We're going to pull this money entirely and we're not going to fund this project. Historically, we have not seen that happen often. I think what is they're more likely to do is replace the grantee with another organization. Because, you know, when they terminate a grant entirely, particularly if it's a housing grant, the folks living in that project often, unfortunately, return to homelessness. So we don't see them terminate grants. Historically, we have not seen them terminate grants often. Finally, in the event that something really egregious happens, right, I think, you know, most of the time, you know, if you've made an ineligible expenditure, it's an honest mistake, right? Somebody in your program made an honest mistake, you're going to correct it, carry forward, right? If something really egregious that rises to criminal activity happens, like you steal money, or, you know, you take money and you go on a trip to Vegas, right? That's likely criminal. And then the federal government could impose criminal charges, and ultimately, you know, there could be a jail sentence associated. Now, that's, again, extremely unlikely and rare in these programs. So, all right, I think we're going to do another poll. Should I do it? I should just do it together as a group.
That poll is the one that is on the Mentimeter.
Okay. So
yeah, I can't project the results, but we could do, yeah.
Yeah, so if everybody wants to click on that link that Sarah put into the, maybe you already have because you answered it the last time, but if you want to click on that and see if you can answer these questions, and then we'll talk about the answers as a group. We'll give you a couple minutes to do that. So it looks like we've got about 14 people who've responded already. All right. So first question, can projects expend CoC funds on expenses that are not eligible under the CoC program interim rule, but not delineated, that are eligible, excuse me, under the CoC program interim rule, but not delineated in the approved project budget? And the answer to that is no, you cannot do that. You can only expend CoC funds on expenses that meet both of those criteria. They are in the CoC interim rule and they are in your approved project budget. The second question, if the CoC program interim rule does not specify that an expense is ineligible, can you assume that it is eligible? No. Even though the rule does explicitly state certain expenses are ineligible, if the rule does not state that a particular expense is eligible, it is not eligible. You cannot assume it's eligible. So only things that are explicitly stated in the CoC program rule as eligible are in fact eligible. And then finally, what risks does a project face if they charge an ineligible expense? And the answer here, everyone got it correct, is all of the above. So they can issue a monitoring finding and impose a corrective action plan. They can require the grantee to reimburse for the expense, and they can reduce future funding and or terminate your agreement. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Howard. I don't think we had any questions come in chat, did we? In the Q&A?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Howard.
Hi,
If you
everybody.
have any questions, let us know.
Yeah, we're here. We're here. So as you can see, we're getting into some detail upon the eligible supportive services costs. As Lauren has said more than once in her presentation, in order for a cost to be eligible under the Continuum of Care program, it must be specifically identified in the regulations. These are the allowable supportive services costs. There, on a lot of these costs, there's some additional details. For example, you see the second one down, moving, truck rental, and moving company. Those are reasonable costs, and basically, generally speaking, the rule is it's a one-time moving expense only that you're going to pay for under this. Again, you can see under child care, there are some additional limitations on that. As you can see here, basically, if the child is not a disabled child, you can only provide child care for them up to the age of 13. But if it is a young person with disabilities, you can provide them with childcare up to the age of 18. So that's important on that. Right, the next slide, the next service over is legal services. Note very clearly that the regulations specifically exclude assistance on immigration matters as something that is allowable legal service. I tell you, I mean, the demand that's going to be, many of you know I live out here on Cape Cod, and we're getting word right now that ICE is basically pulling people over and arresting people here on Cape Cod for immigration offenses. So it's happening everywhere. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to use our resources under the Continuum of Care program to assist folks in doing that. Outreach, outreach is both a direct activity. You can have a supportive services grant that really focuses on providing outreach, especially to people who are living unsheltered. But outreach is also a way in which existing current programs can use to engage people who might be good participants in the program and seek to engage them in services to participate. These other kinds of services like mental health, outpatient health, and substance use treatment services, those are all eligible expenses under the program, but we would always say that before you want to charge continual care program for those expenses, you want to make sure that there is no mainstream resource, Medicaid or other resources like that, that can pay for those services. You should only use continuum of care services for those folks when there is no other mainstream way to pay for those services, and it's essential that they receive that. What else? And remember, when we look at things like utility deposits, it's very important to read that word deposits. You cannot pay for regular utilities under the supportive services budget line, but you can indeed pay for the deposits that are necessary in order to establish that service. Remember, having utilities on in a unit is basically essential to the habitability of that unit. So if those utilities get turned off, that unit is not going to be habitable. It's not going to meet housing quality standards. It could be a major problem for your participants. Okay, let's go. We've got some more detail on some of these other line items. So let's go to the next slide and get some of those details. Okay, so one thing, and you will notice this, especially when you're applying for funds for the first time in under the Continuum of Care program, if we get the opportunity to apply for new program projects again, you can basically cover the costs of operating the costs of operating a supportive services space. So if you're housing your supportive services staff in another location and there are furniture, utilities, equipment that are necessary to house that supportive services staff, they are all would be considered to be eligible supportive services expenses. On the detailed budget that you would fill out when you're first applying for these funds, they would be listed as operating costs at the very bottom of that supportive services budget, and that's where you would reflect that cost. Next slide, please. Okay, now transportation is another one that has some, if you will, some finer points in terms of what it is that is eligible. Transportation can be eligible on two sides. You can provide transportation to your program participants, and also you can cover the transportation costs of your staff. Program, for the most part, we're going to cover program participants travel by reimbursing them for public transportation. As you can see here, it's really not, you cannot reimburse them for all transportation they're going to have in the course of the day. I mean, if they're using transportation for a recreational purpose, for example, or just a social purpose, that is not reimbursable under the program, but you can reimburse them for travel if they're going to medical care, if they're going to employment, bringing their kids for childcare, or engaging out of the services that are eligible under the program. For those reasons, you can pay for their transportation. For other reasons, you're not allowed to pay for their transportation. If you've got case managers, and we certainly, and I'm sure you do it, who conduct home visits or doing trying to do an in vivo assessment of folks, and they're using their personal vehicles to provide that to be able to access the participant's home, then you can reimburse them for the use of their private vehicles. Of course, if you're reimbursing them for private vehicles, remember that is limited by a rate that is established, a per mile rate that is established by the federal government. You cannot reimburse them for more than the per mile rate that is established by the federal government. Also, if you are reimbursing staff, remember, one thing you're not allowed to do is reimburse people for commuting expenses. So, for example, if you have a staff who regularly drives from home to your office, but on Thursday morning, instead of going directly to your office, they're going to go visit a client at their home. Basically, what they have to do is deduct the mileage that they would normally use for commuting purposes to office from whatever they would do to go to that person, because we cannot be reimbursing them for their commute to the office. You can also, some agencies have agency vans or agency-owned vehicles. If that is the case, if the vehicle is owned by the agency, then basically the cost of purchasing or leasing that vehicle is an eligible program expense. Obviously, you want to, as Lauren has said before, you want to maintain a lot of documentation as to how that vehicle is being used. You want to keep a log basically inside the vehicle. Whenever anybody turns on that vehicle, they should note the mileage and the purpose, the mileage at the start, the mileage at the end, and the purpose for using that vehicle, so we will know it was also used for an eligible expense. Again, if you're using that agency-owned vehicle, gas, insurance, taxes, etc., are allowable expenses. Finally, you can sometimes, if we've got participants who are new to the area or participants who just need a little more support, and basically for the first times when they're going to either visit their doctor, their therapist, you might want to accompany them and to show them, help them sort of show them how it is to effectively use that public transportation. That is an allowable expense as well. Next slide, there is another eligible use of transport. Oh, okay. But I think we've got another one. You hit the next slide, please. There we go. Nope. Next one. Yeah. Nope. Go down one. Go down two, because I think there's another transportation one. Oh, never mind. Go back. I thought there was. The other transportation one is, I don't know where it is, but it's in case there is a potential thing of being able to reimburse folks for repairs to their vehicle. If the only way that people can get to a job, get to another essential meeting is by using their privately owned vehicle, and there's not adequate public transportation in the community, and that car needs to be repaired, you can use program funds to repair that vehicle, but you cannot pay more than 10% of the Blue Book value of the vehicle. And I see that we have a question, or at least a raised hand.
I had a question. It's not for the transportation. I don't know if you're going to address this further with utility stuff, but in our, I don't know if it's like the actual HUD agreement, but I know it had stated for utilities it said up to 3 months, and I know you just mentioned that it was only for deposit costs. So just wanted to find out whether or not does that vary individually?
So what I was talking about under supportive services is paying for utility deposits. And basically the rule under paying for a utility deposit would be very similar to the rules that Lauren went through on other procurements. Basically, it's got to be reasonable and necessary. So as long as that utility deposit satisfies that reasonable rule, you can pay that utility deposit on behalf of the folks. Now, when it comes to reimbursing folks for their utility cost, their actual utility costs, it depends on how it is the project is being assisted. If the project is being assisted under the rental assistance budget line item, then the participants are entitled to get the utility allowance as developed by their local public housing authority. And up to that, you can basically cover their utility expenses only up to the utility allowance established by your local PHA. If they're getting assistance if you're supporting their housing under the operating cost line, then utilities are an eligible cost under the operating cost line, and you can pay for the reasonable utility costs of that unit under the operating cost line. And finally, if you're paying for them under the leasing cost line, it really is going to depend. If the utilities are included in the lease, then you can pay for it on the leasing line. Otherwise, it would just be the same utility allowance as we specified under rental assistance. Hopefully that helps. Can we be reimbursed so the question was, can transportation include ride sharing like Uber and Lyft? And the answer to that is yes. I mean, generally speaking, again, you'd want to do an assessment because we wanted to, again, do these things at the lowest and most reasonable cost for the government. So if there is adequate public transportation, it's within the hours in which public transportation is arriving, and the participant is not otherwise disabled, so that it would be very difficult for them to use public transportation. So the preference would be to use public transportation, but if that's not a viable means for transporting the residents, either the transportation does not exist, or it's outside of the operating hours, or they need more assistance than can be provided by that local public transit, then Uber or Lyft or other ride sharing would be an allowable expense. But you want to make sure that there isn't a more economic alternative before you use those services. Here we have on this slide some limitations on supportive services. Again, we've been walking through some of the real details on the supportive services budget line that limit how you can spend supportive services funds. So please be sure to follow that link and look at the detail. It's only a couple of pages of what the eligible supportive services expenses are. So read through all the detail on that to familiarize with it. Some things that are not really specified here, but HUD has made clear. So for example, if you're a licensed social worker and you need to do either some coursework or you need to do either continuing education work and stuff like that, HUD is not going to cover the costs of your staff training or their cost of obtaining your licensures. HUD belief is that is the responsibility of the licensed professional to maintain their own license credentials. Same thing if you've got an MD or somebody like that on your staff. They're licensed by the state of Rhode Island. HUD is not going to pay for the cost of them maintaining those credentials. Costs on providing training on CoC requirements. By the way, what you are doing now is attending a training on CoC requirements. This is not a supportive services cost. Even if you're a case manager right now, your time right now, if you want to bill your CoC grant for these costs, you'll be billing it on the admin budget line, not the supportive services budget line. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. So, so yes, indeed, you can provide food to your program participants. You can help them cover the costs of their food and nutrition. However, as this slide is showing you, there is a real difference between covering the costs of for food for your program participants and covering the cost of food for program staff. Generally speaking, HUD considers that any food for program staff to be basically it's an ineligible expense. I think it's considered to be an entertainment expense, and you're just not allowed to do it. It is a great team building thing. It is really nice on occasions to be able to take your staff out and show appreciation for it, but just don't charge HUD or your CoC grant for that morale building activity. Next slide, please. Okay, so here was the car repair things that I wanted to get to earlier. So that's the bottom here. The rule around, those of you who have attended some of these trainings before may have remembered a slightly different interpretation of the gift card rule. It used to be more of a blanket prohibition on using gift cards. Now, be careful. The problem with using gift cards is that they can be exchanged for cash pretty readily, and that is a no-no, because if it's exchanged for cash, we don't know what those funds are being used for. So if you're going to use a gift card, like say a Stop and Shop gift card or something like that, because you want to assist your participants in getting food, you're going to want to get a receipt back from them that would show you and have a documentation that that gift card was actually used for eligible food expense items and was not being used for something else entirely, like, for example, buying lotto tickets at the Stop and Shop instead of groceries. So again, you want to document. If you do use a gift card, be very careful and be sure to get extra documentation to show how that gift card was used. As I said, there are these limited circumstances. If you happen to have a participant who owns a vehicle, there are these limited circumstances under which you can help them repair it. For many folks, I mean, if they've got a vehicle, it's the only way they can get to work. That's the only way they can raise the money they need to support their family, pay their share of the rent, and things like that. If that car doesn't work, they're going to lose the opportunity to do all those things. So HUD recognizes that there can be circumstances under which we can assist in that repair, because that really is directly related to them being able to maintain stable housing. Next slide, please. Okay. And we've said this already, but I'll highlight it again. You know, any of these services, childcare, if you're using the services of an attorney, and if you're using, you know, substance use treatment, mental health services, primary medical care, in all those instances, the provider must be duly licensed by the state of Rhode Island in order to provide those services. You know, generally speaking, the one you really want to pay more careful attention to is going to be the child care center, because there are informal child care arrangements. Some of those informal child care arrangements might not be licensed by the state of Rhode Island, and therefore are not going to be an eligible reimbursable expense. Generally speaking, mental health clinics and substance use treatment centers are indeed having licensed and certified staff, but you want to make sure that that is the case. Next slide, please. Okay. Here comes another poll. Are we going to be, what are we doing?
Let's just read it because I can't.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about what could be or could not be eligible. So the first one is, which is ineligible, peer support services. Folks have a sense on that? I mean, peer support services, generally speaking, would be an eligible expense because they are peer support workers, can be a great way. They would be peer support and generally paid for and hired by the agency, and they are supporting individuals either on recovery, mental health rehabilitation services like that. That is eligible. Gift card to Stop and Shop, we spoke to that. It's potentially eligible, but you really want to do a follow-up on that and get some receipts in terms of what that gift card was used for, so you can document to HUD that the expenses were going actually for grocery items and not ineligible items. Supervision for case managers, yeah, obviously, you know, I don't need to tell you folks that this is clinically very, very challenging work. And a lot of times our case managers do not have that much clinical training. So it is really important to provide regular supervision to your case management staff to make sure that they have the kind of support necessary in order to carry out their really challenging job. So that is definitely an eligible staff. Food for staff, I think we talked about that very clearly, that there's a prohibition on that. It is what it is. That's not an allowable expense. English as a second language classes, very, very useful for, I mean, I think there was an executive order that spoke to this. So, unfortunately, as we have said very clearly, in order for a cost to be an eligible supportive service cost, it's got to be specifically identified in the regulations as an eligible supportive services cost. As you can probably recall, English as a second language was not one of those eligible costs that we identified in there. So even though it'd be a valuable thing for folks to be able to increase their English proficiency, that's not an eligible expense. This one is childcare for a 13-year-old who is not disabled. Well, up to 13 is what you can pay for childcare. So once children past the age of 13, between 13 and 18, in order for them to be, for their child care to be reimbursed by the Continuum of Care program, they would need to be disabled. So that is not going to be eligible. Okay. Now that was a little test for me. Hopefully you guys learned a little in the process. How do we pay for furniture? You know, I remember, I don't know, for those of you who've been around a long time, way back at the start of the Obama administration, I think we had this thing called Homeless Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program, HPRP, and we actually succeeded in getting a lot of people into housing for the first time under that program. And I was working with some folks in Indiana, and I spoke to the program manager. She said, you know, we're getting all these people into housing and they're sitting on the floor. And it is not good for folks not to have, I mean, and we see this all the time, and people are who are unhoused are really eager to have a home, but if they then have a home that has got nothing in it, it gets a little depressing, and it gets hard to be really attached to that unit that is completely vacant with nothing but a door in it. So it's really important that we do everything we can to have, when we place people in housing, that we help them make that as much a home as possible for them. The regulations don't help us as much as we would like them to. If you happen to have a grant with an operating cost budget line, you can use that operating cost budget line to pay for furniture. If you have a supportive services budget line, you can pay for desks and equipment for your supportive service staff under the supportive services budget line. If you are funded under rental assistance, you basically cannot use program funds to pay for furniture for those participants as much as you would like to be able to do that. You know, obviously we recommend thrift stores, furniture banks, any other resource like that where we can get lower cost furniture for participants, so as to be able to assist them in having a fully furnished unit. There are a lot of resources like that that can assist folks. We're going to have a session in a few weeks talking about the youth homeless demonstration projects. There are a lot of additional provisions that they allow under the youth homeless demonstration program that are not allowed in the regular CoC program. So there are ways to pay for furniture if you are funded under the YHDP program, and we'll talk about that in much more detail in a few weeks. Next slide, please. How do we pay for household supplies? That's another thing. Obviously, people really, you know, and need those, you know, vacuums, mops, brooms, various kinds of cleaning supplies and things like that in order to be able to maintain their housing. If it is something that is necessary basic and you've got an operating cost budget line, you can pay for the costs that are supplies that are necessary to maintain and repair housing. That's not necessarily cleaning supplies, it's more property maintenance supplies, but that's eligible as an operating cost. You can also, to a limited extent, if basically what you need to do is, you know, you're helping people who've been unhoused for a period of time and they need some support in learning, picking up some basic housekeeping and other skills. And in order really to impart their skills on folks, you've got to have the equipment that they're going to be working with. So under that, you can basically, under life skills training, which is an eligible supportive service cost under life skills training, you can purchase the necessary cleaning supplies. Oh, thank you, Lauren, for that clarification. ESL is an allowable activity. I completely misspoke before, and Lauren has completely corrected me. Please ignore what I said earlier. Now, to teach, again, if folks need support in maintaining their in keeping up their housing, and they need supplies in order to do that, you can purchase those supplies under life skills training. That is probably not expected to be a cost that you're going to incur every month or so. But again, if they need more time, more support, you can probably justify providing some additional assistance to them in order to do that. There are immediate support, under outreach, you can provide a lot of expenses to address urgent physical needs, blankets and toiletries and stuff like that. There are limited extensions. To a limited extent, you can use those urgent physical needs things under outreach to provide some of the urgent needs, such as blankets and toiletries and stuff like that, again, to help people get established and be able to use their home. And finally, as this slide is also saying, under the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, you are given greater latitude to pay for those household supplies for participants. So you can do, basically the answer is you can provide limited household supplies under the life skills training. Be sure when you're doing that, you can show that it's in conjunction with training people on how to effectively maintain their unit. Next slide, please.
I think we have a question.
Oh.
Joyce?
I do have a question. As far as like a tenant, a client that we have who's housed, but we don't have operating funds, would it cover like a cleaning company to come in and help them with their unit?
Lauren, what do you think? My thought is probably not. I mean,
yeah, I'm not thinking of a way. Sometimes you can find, places, and I'm not immediately thinking of one either, Howard.
Is it like a very, very bad situation where it's almost like a hoarding kind of a service?
Yeah, let's say yes, and it's a hazardous place, or
I mean, you might be able to, I don't know, Howard, what you think about this. I mean, you might be able to say that it's part of case management, right? Like if you can contract for case management services, right? So if you're hiring somebody that's coming in to help somebody manage hoarding disability, right? That you might be able to do it under case management, you think, Howard?
Under mental health, maybe mental health.
Mental health, they'd have to be a licensed practitioner. So I think it's going to be hard to.
I don't know. We've approached this subject a bunch of times over the last 20 years. And, I think, I don't know. I can't really get a complete answer.
I mean, the thing that you definitely can do.
Because it's not listed.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that you definitely could do would be to submit it as an AAQ to HUD and see what they say. As you submit the AAQ, try to frame it in a way that it fits under one of the categories like case management to make it more likely that you get a positive response.
Would they be more positive also if it wasn't ongoing, but it was like
a one time?
No.
All right, we'll just find other ways to fund that.
We wish the answer was a resounding yes, but
one day it will be.
Now, one thing we do know for sure, I mean, if the participant has left the unit and they left it with a lot of stuff in it, then you could spend up to 1 month's rent to basically work on getting that unit back into condition. But that's not going to help you keep them in the unit.
No.
Okay, how do we pay for office supplies? Okay, so clearly if you're doing supportive services, then all the, the computers, the pens and paper, stuff like that, is an eligible supportive service expense. The cell phones that your case manager use are eligible expenses under supportive services. So are their laptops, so are their, if they use a hotspot or something like that to connect to the internet while they're away from the office, all of those things would be eligible under supportive services. If there are, as this other bullet says, if it's basically, supplies for your fiscal office, supplies for your human resources department and stuff like that, they would be expenses that you'd probably be covering if you are requesting indirect costs for your project. Those would be examples of eligible indirect costs. Next slide, please. Okay. You know,
I just looked at
please.
the interim rule, so I just want to respond again to the hoarding thing. So so if you could frame it in a way where the contractor is in the course of doing the cleaning, working with the tenant to teach the tenant critical life skills, right? Then you could probably frame it under the life services subcategory within case management. But I know sometimes, when people have hoarding tendencies, right, it's very hard to do the cleaning when they're in the unit. So if it's not like a teaching thing, then probably no. Or Howard, just chime in if that.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we've talked about what the eligible budget lines are, but actually there is about 2 years ago, HUD added an eligible budget line to all Continuum of Care program grants, and it is the Violence Against Women Act eligible expenses. Remember, the Violence Against Women Act applies to basically all human beings, who may be subject to interpartner violence issues and things like that. Remember, all participants in the Continuum of Care program have the right to request an emergency transfer. They can request an emergency transfer if they are in a situation where they consider themselves to be unsafe. Participants are the ones who make the decision as to what constitutes a safe dwelling for them, not the program. And if a participant requests an emergency transfer because they are unsafe, they're at risk of partner violence, you can and indeed are required to assist them in an emergency transfer to another safe unit. This list here is of all the expenses that you can pay to help people do an emergency transfer. That means you can pay for moving costs, and that could be an additional. Remember, I said before, under supportive services, it's really a one-time moving cost, but for VAWA, you can provide an additional move in order to allow that participant to go to a safe place rather. You also can actually pay for their travel costs for them to relocate outside of Rhode Island. If for whatever reason they feel that their perpetrator, they just cannot be safe there, they don't have a safe place to go, you can assist them to relocate away from the state. Obviously, I'm saying the state here because there's only one continuum of care in the state of Rhode Island. You can pay for the security deposits that's necessary for them to move into a new unit. Again, pay these security deposits, pay utility deposits, or pay for the costs of establishing the utility services. If there are application fees for the units they want to move to, if there are pet fees for that unit, and again, if it's a pet fee that you're paying for, you want to demonstrate that having that large, very friendly, but threatening looking dog is necessary for the safety of the participants. You can also pay for certain technologies like Ring doorbells and things like that. And as well as those safety doorbells, also the internet connections that they need in order to effectively function. You can pay for that as a VAWA emergency transfer cost. The management that you're going to have in order to facilitate the emergency transfer is also an eligible expense, and housing navigation basically means whatever support you can provide to people to help them locate that unit that they consider to be safe. These are all eligible costs. Now, if you are any entity that has a CoC grant is eligible to ask for costs under the VAWA budget line. If it's a new project application, you simply estimate the cost that you're going to have for VAWA expenses and include that in your budget. If it's an existing renewal grant, you're allowed to, as part of the annual application process, you're allowed to basically move funds from one of your budget lines into the VAWA budget line. Remember, you can move no more than 10% of that budget line into the VAWA budget line in order to, as part of the annual renewal process. So I think let me see, that question just came in. And the question, how do we substantiate the person served as eligible under VAWA? Any participant in your program every one of the participants has the right to request an emergency transfer. They need to, once they are a participant in your program, they basically need to both the first thing is an incident certification, show that they really have had a reason why they are unsafe in that unit, and then they have the right to request an emergency transfer. Basically, all people are eligible. All people are entitled to make that determination that they do not feel safe, and it is not the program's role to determine whether or not that person is accurate in their feeling, whether they feel safe or not. It is the participant's determination that they are not safe. Do I have that one right, Lauren? I think she nodded, so yay.
That's right. I'm looking up, I'll put the incident certification form that people can use to self-certify into the chat as soon as I get it.
Great.
Great, thank you.
And next slide, I think we're all there. There's both. Yeah, exactly. So there are two cost items that you can ask for funds under the VAWA budget line. The first was emergency transfer facilitation. This one is confidentiality compliance. And basically it's for these expenses here: monitoring and evaluating, developing strategies for corrective actions, training, reporting on compliance, and staff time on maintaining confidentiality. I see far more grantees requesting funding under the emergency transfer than on confidentiality compliance training. I think that might be more of either a coordinated entry sometimes, or, you know, if we've got a provider who is funded under the DV bonus component, may be doing more work on supporting people on confidentiality compliance costs. Next slide, please. Oh, here we go. So as I said, here it says it. So basically, again, new project application, basically your budget is yours to determine up to the allowable costs. So you just basically put funding for that category on it. Or a renewal application, again, just request those funds by shifting lines. Again, you know, you want to estimate. The assumption is obviously not everybody in your program would request an emergency transfer. So ideally have just, you know, sufficient funds under that budget line to cover the number of instances in which you might expect folks to need an emergency transfer. Next slide, please. Okay, the homeless management information system. They're basically, by the way, there are two different entities that get HMIS lines. There is the HMIS lead agency. The HMIS lead agency can actually ask for further expenses under the HMIS budget line, but also all grantees, and Rhode Island is a little different. Many grantees in Rhode Island do have funds under the HMIS budget line. Elsewhere, it's not as common. I don't know why. It's just a little more common for grantees to request funding under the HMIS budget line. Perfectly allowable. I mean, it's basically talking about, you know, staff and overhead costs that you have and expenses that you incur in contributing data to the homeless management information system. As you can see, that could include, you know, computer hardware and software in order to do it, staff time in order to compile that data. If you have to lease some additional space to house those HMIS workers, if there's additional utility costs associated with HMIS, all of those are allowable expenses for any CoC funded project to request funding under the HMIS budget line. There's a few more, I think, on our next slide. Yes, and again, eligible HMIS expenses for all grantees are, you know, salaries for operating and contributing data in HMIS, traveling to approved HMIS trainings, and those are only HUD approved trainings. Staff travel costs, if they have to go out and visit the participant somewhere remote from the office, you can pay for that under the HMIS budget lead. And depending on how your HMIS lead works, if you need to pay licensing fees, license fees or something like that for participation in HMIS, you can use your HMIS budget line to cover those costs. Okay. Oh. You know, I think this is our last poll of the day. And this one, it's not really right or wrong answers, which is the good news, is because I'm not going to give you a wrong answer on this one. But basically, it's up to you. I mean, do you feel like you need to make any adjustments? No, because you found nothing that we told you today that was not completely aligned with how you're operating. that's great. There might be a couple of minor things that you heard today that didn't necessarily agree with what you were doing. Again, the goal is to correct it going forward. We're not going to, we can't go backwards in life. We can only go forward, but we try to go forward as correctly as possible. And that's what we'll do. Or, we'll follow up and make sure. Otherwise, take a look, make sure, speak to other members of your staff, make sure that you are operating in full compliance. I see that Lauren has given us the VAWA incident certification form. Again, remember, the participant self-certifies that there's a VAWA incident and they need protection. It's always the participant, the victim, the person who is in fear. Tracy.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm not able to use the chat for some reason. I don't know. Can't enter anything, but I just wanted to ask a question about staff costs. So at our agency, we have a few different roles that work with people in our housing. We have like a case manager, we have housing navigators, and we also have clinicians, all who get billed under the supportive services grant. If for some reason, like 2 people saw a client at the same time, say like a housing navigator and a housing advocate were meeting with somebody to talk about looking for a unit or a problem that they were having with maintenance or things like that, would we be able to account for both staff's time? Because I think right now we're documenting it as collateral.
So my sense is, yes, you could. I mean, I think that you want to be specific that they're doing 2 separate things, that the person who's providing navigation support is really talking about what the other housing opportunities are for that participant, and the case manager is helping the participant to assess what their need is, most appropriate need. So under those circumstances, I think that's allowable. I mean, another time could be that suppose you've got a program director or a case manager supervisor, and you want both the supervisor and the case manager to meet with the participant at the same time, both to get some, a little support by the supervisor in understanding, that participant's needs, or to get different perspectives. Again, as long as you can identify the 2 roles and that they're not duplication, but performing some slightly different duties, that would be perfectly allowable.
All right, great, thanks. Yeah, because right now what we're having staff do is like split, like if they're with the person for a half hour, we like have each of them do like 15 minutes. So we were just wondering if it was like 2 distinct, different services or supports.
Yep. I mean, again, ideally, both would maintain some kind of case notes because they both participated in it. And as long as their case notes are reflecting their respect, mine as a housing navigator, I'm going to talk about, what housing options I discussed, or if I'm the case manager, just as long as their case notes reflect their differing roles in supporting that participant, then I think you've got great documentation.
All right, great. Thank you.
As these slides are sent out to you, you will notice that there are, as Lauren said at the start of our session, there are a couple of other slides that we haven't gone through today. That content is going to be covered elsewhere, especially by the TAC trainings that are coming up. But we have that content. We're sharing it with you. It's just there as an additional resource. Any other questions? Lauren, that link I guess it's the VAWA incident certification link that's not working?
I did. That link it's not going to open up a page on your website. It's going to download a document to your computer. So I'll also put in the page right now. I'm doing that. So here's the page. If you click this link, that will open up the page. And then on the right-hand column on that page, you'll see it's HUD 5382 certification of domestic violence, blah, blah, blah. That's where you'd want to click.
It's possible that we may see some changes in the rules around the Continuum of Care program and how it operates, but we want to be very explicit that we have not seen any official changes to the HUD rules as they impact the Continuum of Care program to date. It's only as they go, if they go through a rulemaking process which has comments, would there be actual changes to the rules or regulations on this program? Quick question, under VAWA, would paying the tenant's first month's portion of rent and eligible cost. Well, certainly, if not using the VAWA funds, you can certainly be using your rental assistance funds for paying their share of the first month's, well, not the tenant's share, because the tenant is still going to be required to pay their 30% of their adjusted income for the rent. They're still going to be required to pay it, but certainly the program can pay the program share of the rent as they move to the unit, but it'd be under the rental assistance, not under the VAWA budget line. So for your reference, on March 31st, there's going to be a training on the differences between program administrative costs and indirect costs. That's a topic that everybody can use some rehearing on, because it's really complex and occasionally confusing. So please participate in that session. And then we're going to be joining you again in early April to talk about the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, which Rhode Island has been a participant in for about the past 3 years or so. Any more questions? And not hearing any, I don't think we're going to ask you to have to stare at us any longer than is absolutely necessary. And it may not be necessary that much longer. So I think we can, not having other questions, I think we can. Oh, they want our emails for follow-up questions. Yeah. Well, you can see our names here. So we have a pretty easy thing on Housing Innovations. I'm H. Birchman at housinginnovations.us. We'll put him in the chat. Oh, here, I'll do mine. I think we'll give you, 20 minutes plus of your day back, which is not a terrible thing on a Wednesday afternoon. Thank you all for staying with us for this training. Really appreciate your time. Of course, we appreciate everything that you do, which is the real work that's being done. So thank you for that. And hope to see you again soon.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank
everybody,
you.
for
Bye.
attending.